Israel, Palestine, and the United States. In this module, we'll be looking at to what extent the US has acted as peacemaker, or in fact has not acted as peacemaker in that conflict. With any conflict, we have narratives. Narratives are there to explain, to illustrate, serve as a reference point of anything. You know, any affairs, foreign affairs, any political affairs, we have narratives. We try to explain something, and we use that particular narrative. The three narratives of that conflict, the Zionist, the Arab-Palestinian, as well as a structural explanation. The Zionist would be the conflict stems from persistent refusal of Arab states to recognize the legitimacy of Israel. You know, the Jewish national movement created a modern community as an act of refuge after a persecution throughout Jewish history, culminating with the Holocaust, of course. The dominant Arab-Palestinian narrative is a story of forceful displacement, continuous occupation of the indigenous Arab population, takeover by land and settlement as an issue of injustice and subjugation. And then there's the structural explanation, which looks at how the post-Ottoman region remains characterized by unstable governance, protracted underdevelopment economically, and then geostrategic reasons continues to invite the great powers, so external powers going in and influencing and meddling in foreign affairs. So again, outside powers continuously are tempted to dominate for their own reason. These are the three narratives. Now, if you're looking at narratives of victimization, oppression, and hate, both of them have these narratives. Israelis and Palestinians view themselves as the victims of each other, as well as betrayed or abandoned by the international community. So violent actions on both sides have let Israelis and Palestinians feel deprived of security and a sense of peace. And of course, they're unable and perhaps unwilling to acknowledge the mutual conflict, mutual nature of that particular conflict. And then the most important variable here is the religious factor, that it's not only a conflict among strategic, national, and interconnected communities, but it also is a conflict among myths, about religious myths, and what the particular Jerusalem, as one example, one city, which attracts so much reverence from all three religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. We have three levels of the conflict. It's the local between Palestinians and Israelis. It's the issue of occupation, terrorism, economic disaster, entrenched in identity and experience, and there's the sense of victimhood again on both sides. And then this sort of culture, political culture, and sense of victimhood has been handed over from generation to generation. It's influenced, secondly, by a larger relationship between the Arab world and Israel. So first, Arab countries wanted to speak on behalf of the Palestinians without the Palestinians themselves. And now we have the Palestinians negotiating with the Israelis bilaterally without actually having any of the Arab states being part of that. And lastly, the international community. First, we had the French-British impact on the map in the Middle East, the two French and British empires. And now the United States is a third-party mediator, but also, of course, as a very powerful external patron for Israel. And then we have the Jews and Arabs in the diaspora also influencing respective policies, both in Europe, across the Middle East, and, of course, in the United States. Now, this conflict is intractable. When we're looking at intractable conflicts, that they are difficult to identify where the starting point is, and certainly they seem to be immune to any sort of intervention, and there's no termination point. That is the case in Israel-Palestine. Now, for the Palestinians, the method of struggle has been to use their bodies and words towards a Jewish national movement, which is better funded, more advanced, and also better linked to the flow of international power. For the Israelis, they're again successor of the Zionist movement. The struggle method of struggle has been threefold: continue to be superior power, continue with settlement of land, and remain linked to the dominant external power, in this case, the United States. Now, again, you can see every action intended by Israel to end terrorism or any sort of security is perceived by Palestinians as an act of occupation, and every Palestinian attempt to resist occupation and strive towards sovereignty is seen as an act of terrorism by Israelis. That's why a third-party intervention is so incredibly important in this conflict. Only a third authoritative party, which both parties respect, can disentangle Israel's war against terrorism from Israel's war to maintain occupation, and likewise can disentangle the Palestinians' war against occupation from the Palestinians' war to destroy Israel's statehood as perceived by Israelis. There's a huge lack of trust between both parties. We have this, political culture which is being fostered over a generation. Both parties can continue with inflicting pain on the other, and with Israel certainly being the more powerful party between the two. But that is not the same as winning. That is not the same, of course, as achieving peace or stability. Now, the question, of course, is the US still an honest broker? Now, again, if you look at the history of the conflict, Israel won after it declared independence in 1948 and sovereignty. It had more control than it was given under the UN partition plan. And of course, the war was a disaster for over 1.3 million Palestinians. They had to flee. They were forcibly expelled from what is today Israel, either Egyptian-controlled Gaza, Jordanian-controlled the West Bank, as well as other refugee camps in other Arab countries, Syria and Lebanon. Now, again, the very house keys to the houses which they were expelled from had been handed down from generation to generation. And they're living now in refugee camps which have really morphed into permanent cities, whether we're looking at the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria. Now, 67, what we mentioned in the previous model, was an important conflict because it redrew the map of the entire Middle East. Israel gained a lot more territory before. Resolution 242 by the UN Security Council serves as an important reference point because it demands Israel to withdraw its armed forces from the territories occupied in the recent conflict. Now, again, in international law, it is illegal to acquire new territory by military occupation or military conquest. The same would apply to Russia and Ukraine in 2014. It was after that, in the 70s, 80s, that the PLO started to have a lot more high-profile airplane hijackings, as well as attacks against Israeli interests. The most important one being the 1972 Munich Olympics incident, which we had Palestinian terrorist group taking Israeli athletes hostage in Munich during the Olympics. Again, to the lifeblood of terrorism is massive exposure and communication. That's why they chose, because international media were present. It ended in a disaster and the death of all of the Israeli athletes as well as the Palestinian terrorists. A good movie to watch is Munich by Steven Spielberg, which follows Israeli intelligence after the Olympic Games in retaliation against perceived masterminds of that particular attack. So that's the movie Munich by Steven Spielberg. So here you see that Israel acquired here the West Bank from Jordan, the Golan Heights from Syria, the security zone that it acquired in 1982, and the entire Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Now, again, to this day, Israel occupies the West Bank and the Golan Heights, as well as surrounds the Gaza Strip and its de facto occupation of the Gaza Strip. Here you can see the gradual loss of land of Palestinians. That only looks at 46 till 2000, and it shows you as a substantial, of course, loss of territory. A new, if there was in future a sovereign Palestinian country, it would be the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and of course that also is an issue of how those two territories were to be connected. The biggest threat to two-state solution remains settlement, Jewish settlers in the West Bank, which has skyrocketed over the years. So that looks 72 to 2002. We have, close to 500,000 settlers now in the West Bank. Now, again, if you look at global views of Israel, that's largely unfavorable. It looks that the US is the outlier here. US public compared to Europe and of course Middle Eastern countries, where you have a largely unfavorable views of Israel, largely because of the continuous occupation of the West Bank and the elusiveness of a Palestinian sovereign state. Now again, coming back to the role of the United States as a peace broker, the most important one to this day was Bill Clinton's brokerage of the Oslo Accords in 1994. This was the first time that Palestinians and Israelis recognized each other's right to exist. There was a massive breakthrough. So in the left here you have Yitzhak Rabin, Israeli Prime Minister, and Yasser Arafat, Palestinian President, on the lawn of the White House signing the Declaration of Principles. So they, again, not only did they recognize each other's right to exist, but Arafat also came back from exile into the West Bank, into occupied territory, and set up the PA there. So again, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, morphed into the PA, the Palestinian Authority. Now again, the aftermath was rather dramatic. Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli hardliner in 1995 for signing it, for betraying the Israeli cause. Likewise, Arafat also faced fierce criticism by Palestinian hardliners for selling out to the Israelis. Clinton also negotiated the so-called Hebron Protocol, that the city of Hebron in the West Bank, which divided the city into H1 and H2 for Palestinians and Israelis. Was a rather good deal. Jewish population only was 450 persons at the time, 0.3% of the population, but it was still a taboo, which the Israeli Prime Minister, the new Israeli Prime Minister, which was Benjamin Netanyahu, who again in 2016, 17, 15 is the Israeli Prime Minister. This was a taboo because Likud, the more hawkish, right leaning party in Israeli politics, does not make a concession to the Palestinians, and the government broke, and he fell from power because of that. So again, if you're looking at Netanyahu today as Prime Minister, some of that, of course, is very much because of that experience. And that again gives you the idea of how the Declaration of Principles, the Oslo Accords, divided up the West Bank. We have Area A, B, and C. Area A is full civil and security control by Palestinians. Area B is a Palestinian autonomous area. It's full civil, but it's joint Israeli-Palestinian security control. And Area C, this color here, which is most of this here, is full Israeli civil and security control. These triangles here you can see are all Israeli settlements. Now again, the idea was that would be a gradual redeployment withdrawal of Israeli forces out of the West Bank, and a gradual takeover of Palestinian Authority over more than just local affairs. So it would eventually morph into a permanent sovereign state. A lot of that was supposed to happen at Camp David in 2000. New Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. He had a kind of take it or leave it approach. He offered certain concessions to the Palestinians, but he was not interested in negotiating, and there was no wiggle room as far as he was concerned. If you look at Yasser Arafat, he didn't have the following back home. He was severely weakened within the Palestinian politics. He didn't have the following he had back in Camp David, and he himself was rather unwilling to make counter proposals to Barak. Now that was offered. Palestine would have sovereignty over 91% of the West Bank. Israel would annex 10% of the West Bank. In exchange, Palestine would have sovereignty over parts of pre-67 Israel, equivalent to 1% of the West Bank. But there was no indication of where it would be. Issue of refugees, all of these descendants of the original refugees, which were evicted in Palestine in 1948. We're looking at 6 million. There was a proposal only spoke of a satisfactory solution. Israel does not want Palestinian refugees to come back. Jerusalem, Israel would have sovereignty over the Muslim and Christian quarters of the old city, but only a loosely defined permanent custodianship over the Haram al-Sharif, the third holy site in Islam. Palestinians said what was offered was to be the mayor of a suburb of Jerusalem. It was a far cry from having the capital as Jerusalem for the Palestinian state. And of course, you can see the intractability only looking at Jerusalem because both countries want Jerusalem as their capital. Palestinians wanted the immediate withdrawal of the Israelis from the occupied territories, and only then would they crack down against terror organizations. And the Israelis said, no, you crack down first against them, and then we withdraw. Now, who was to blame? Clinton himself in his autobiography said that Arafat was to blame. We have two scholars, political scientists, Norman Finkelstein and Alan Dershowitz. He's at Harvard, a law professor. Finkelstein said, judged from the perspective of Palestinians and Israelis' respective rights under international law, all of the concessions at Camp David came from the Palestinians, none from the Israeli side. And that, of course, is true, given the fact that we're looking at conquered territory after the '67 war and continuous military occupation by the Israelis. Dershowitz said failure of the negotiations was due to the refusal of the Palestinians and Arafat to give up the right of return. That was the sticking point. It wasn't Jerusalem, it wasn't borders, it was the right of return. So again, a lot of blame was cast on the Palestinians. Likewise, a lot of Palestinians cast the blame on Israel. This then led to the second Intifada, the first Intifada being in the 80s, the second Intifada starting in 2000. It was again targeted assassinations of Palestinians, increased terror attacks by Palestinians. Arafat was no longer seen as somebody the Israelis could do business with. It was no longer seen as a partner for peace. We had Operation Defensive Shield, in which Israeli forces went into a refugee camp to allegedly go after suspect terrorists. It led to violent conflict inside a refugee camp, which had lots of Israel was charged by humanitarian organizations for breaking international humanitarian law as well as committing war crimes. And after 2002, Hamas used a lot more suicide bombers to attack Israeli civilians, and Israel began deeper and longer excursions into Palestinian areas to retaliate against. Now, the efforts after that, we had the Roadmap to Peace in 2003. This was suggested by Condoleezza Rice. We have the new Bush administration. She was a three-phase roadmap. First one was both sides would issue statements supporting two-state solution. Palestinians would end violence, act against those engaged in terror, drop a constitution, hold elections, and Israelis would stop settlement activities and act with military restraint. Phase 2 would see the creation of International Conference of a Palestinian state with provisional borders, and Phase 3 was final agreement talks. It didn't go anywhere. The most important initiative by the Bush administration was the disengagement from Gaza in 2005. Now, Gaza had very little biblical relevance to it, while the West Bank is considered by Jews as, Judea and Samaria, the biblical terms. Gaza, there's no biblical historical relevance or religious relevance to it. We had several hundred families which had been settlers in Gaza, so it was a relatively easy disengagement. That was publicly televised. Here you see a photo of Israeli police expelling Israeli settlers from Gaza. It was a big deal. It was televised. And the Israeli government made it very clear that the Gaza pullout was intended to freeze the peace process, prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state, and strengthen Israel's hold on its West Bank settlements. It was at the same time in 2004 that the International Court of Justice ruled that the security fence was illegal because it would annex more territory from Palestine into Israel. So that so-called security fence is the wall the Israelis are building between Israel and Palestine. However, it actually encroaches into Palestinian territory. Annapolis Conference in 2002 was again another initiative between new president of the Palestinian Mahmoud Abbas and the new Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert. It was pretty good working relationship, but that ended very quickly in 2008 when Israel had another military offensive in the Gaza Strip. Now, the last military offensive was 2014, and that comes down to that kind of narrative which is now being used by the Israeli top brass about mowing the grass, that the idea is that Hamas leadership and military facilities must be regularly hit in order to keep them weak. So the destruction of infrastructure by the Israeli armed forces is seen as a deterrent, that it will pay a high price for attacking Israel. So again, this was horrific acts in what is the city of Gaza. And that was sort of the self-defense myth by the Israelis, that they keep saying that Gaza is not a state, but it's a occupied territory. But then they see it as a sovereign country when they see it fit to retaliate against. So again, they call it a hostile entity. So on one side, they don't recognize that Gaza is independent only when Israel can retaliate against. So this is the the issue here, that several countries, the United Nations, the International Committee for the Red Cross, and other international humanitarian organizations, and those who are observing war crimes, that Israel does not respect the principle of proportionality. That there's no line being drawn to distinguish between military targets and civilian targets. That gives you an idea of deaths. We're only looking at the decade after the failure of Camp David in 2000, and you see the different military campaigns. The most important one, Operation Defensive Shield, Operation Summer Rains, Operation Cast Lead in 2009, Operation Pillar of Cloud in 2012, and you see the number of Palestinian deaths as well as Israeli deaths. This gives you an idea of the segregated road system in the West Bank, that Palestinians are unable to freely move within the West Bank because of Israeli checkpoints, because of settlements in the way between Palestinian communities. Again, what is important to understand is, and keep in mind, is that Palestinians are acting under the Israeli military occupation law, whereas Israelis enjoy full civil rights under the Israeli constitution. So again, when President Jimmy Carter talked about peace, not apartheid, he gave a talk at JMU actually in 2009. He refers to the political system in the West Bank as well as the Gaza Strip, but the West Bank in particular, which he likens to an apartheid system. Again, I mentioned the wall earlier. The wall would take in more territory away from Palestine into Israel. We had several rulings by the International Court of Justice that the wall was illegal under international law. Now again, looking at Gaza, Gaza is interesting because Gaza is being governed by Hamas, a terrorist organization. That comes back to that back in 2006, Israel and the US and the EU put a lot of pressure on the Palestinians to have elections. They had elections, and Hamas won. So it was after that that the PA was subject to sanctions. In fact, a civil war broke out between secular Fatah and Islamist Hamas. And after that, it was that Gaza was exclusively being governed by Hamas. Now again, this is curious because Hamas is first and foremost a terrorist organization aimed at fighting the Israelis, but it also now had to prove that they can actually govern, that they can actually be pragmatic enough, pick up the trash, ensure law and order, implement public administration of that entire city. And then it shows you that you have this continuous division in Hamas, the pragmatic versus the military wing, that there are certain elements within Hamas who would be quite happy to have a temporary truce, if not even a peace agreement with the Israelis. And then there's the radical wing, which continues to embrace political violence against Israel. So what we have in Israel-Palestine is the normalization of revenge. Even if retaliation doesn't pay, domestic political conditions always create pressures to take some action. So again, revenge becomes an act in itself. There's this insidious belief that not acting is worse than if one does not respond. The other side will interpret that lack of retaliation as a sign of weakness. And then they do learn from the wrong examples in history, to rationalize predisposition in violence. So again, violence worked in Lebanon, it worked in Gaza, it worked in Libya, it worked in Syria. We can do the same. We will continue. To conclude, the threshold of pain, both in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and Israel, is very high. That, at some point in any conflict, you will have reached this mutually hurting stalemate, and after which it becomes too painful to continue with the conflict. This is not the case in Israel and Palestine. Israel can inflict more pain on the Palestinians, but that is cause of not the same as winning or achieving peace. So we have this cycle of fear and humiliation and helplessness on part of the Palestinians and a sense of insecurity on part of Israel. It's certainly not a fight amongst equals. Israel is linked to US power, and again, the United States is important here because only a third party can intervene and disentangle Israel's war to maintain occupation, as well as Palestine's use of political violence against Israel. So cooperation is unlikely to emerge from learning or exhaustion, to use a game theory expression, but from change in the distribution of power and the role of third parties. Now, I encourage you, if you go back in the syllabus, you see that I want you to play a Peacemaker. You can download it for free. Let me know how you got on. Please state your experience and whether you liked it or not on the Facebook group. Thanks.